You've got people who only like to listen to solved cases. It's one of their things. They only like solved cases. They hate missing persons cases because they're obviously not solved. I don't understand that. Like I can barely get myself in that mindset, because for me, I like the mysteries. I like the unsolved cases, whether it's the murders or the disappearances. But I really love those sort of classic mysteries. And the classic mysteries were a gateway for me to true crime. I didn't start off with true crime. I started off with the classic mysteries, and then sort of that same allure of what happened, who did it, what is the answer, drew me into the true crime stuff. So as I think you and I have talked about before, I think the love of mystery is completely innate in humanity. It goes back as far as you can imagine, and we just see it in different forms today. You know, it's not as if these novels aren't still popular, but you think of the 18th century with the great detectives, whether it's in the early, really mean the 19th century, in the early 20th century with Agatha Christie or Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes and Poirot and even Edgar Allan Poe with the whole Murder in the Rue Morgue thing. I mean, that was sort of big, huge back then. And now we have true crime, and some people think that true crime is a new phenomenon. It's not. It's just the latest iteration of this desire, I think, to solve mysteries.
That's Brett Talley, an author of several best-selling novels and anthologies, including He Who Walks in the Shadows, That Which Shall Not Be, and The Fiddle is the Devil's Instrument. Brett is also the host of the highly rated true crime podcast, the Prosecutors Podcast. This is the Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair. Brett has been twice nominated for the Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement, the top award for horror writing presented annually by the Horror Writers Association. The works of writers who were nominated for the Bram Stoker Award, which is named after the Irish Victorian-era Gothic fiction writer who is the author of Dracula, are done by juries who are members of the Horror Writers Association. That Which Should Not Be was Brett's first novel and was published in 2011. In addition to being nominated for the Bram Stoker Award for a writer's first novel, it was a semi-finalist for the Goodreads Choice Awards and winner of the Journal Stone Horror Writing Contest. That Which Shall Not Be takes readers on a journey to Miskatonic University, a fictional school with a whispered reputation for being connected to the occult and supernatural, where a professor and a student search a nearby village for a book that's believed to control all the non-human forces that rule the earth. The pair bring the book back to Miskatonic University, opening up a gate to the netherworld. Brett was also nominated for a 2014 anthology, Limbus Inc. Book 2, that he edited, where 5 masters of horror, fantasy, and science fiction writing take readers to a world of time travel, human sacrifice, intergalactic beings, and much, much more. Brett is an attorney and also the author of several true ghost stories and a nonfiction book called Haunted Tuscaloosa, which explores the paranormal in an Alabama town, from the now shuttered local insane asylum and antebellum mansions said to be haunted by ghosts, to cemeteries where Confederate soldiers are said to still march, and ghost stories from the University of Alabama grounds. On the Prosecutors Podcast, Brett and his co-host Alice LaCour explore some of the mysteries of true crime, including the strange disappearances of people like the Jack family in British Columbia, the disappearance of Brianna Maitland, the daughter of our former guest Bruce Maitland, and Maura Murray, the little sister of our former guest Julie Murray. Part of their exploration of mysteries includes cases like those of the murders of John Benet Ramsey and Lacey Peterson, as well as whether Michael Peterson killed his wife, or whether, among other possibilities, it was an owl. Often, Brett and Alice help bring clarity to things that seem mysterious, like their exploration of the murder of Ruthie Mae McCoy, which inspired the 1992 movie Candyman, and the story of the real story that inspired the fears of razor blades and poison being in Halloween candy in the episode entitled The Man Who Killed Halloween, Sweet Dreams. Brett and Alice go beyond what might traditionally be considered true crime and have explored unexplained mysteries like Dyatlov Pass, where 9 Soviet hikers died under mysterious circumstances in the Ural Mountains, and the Khmer-Dabain incident, where 6 other Soviet hikers disappeared in the mountains near Lake Baikal in southern Siberia. They also explored topics like the humanoid creatures reportedly seen in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, called the Mothman, whether the moon is hollow, and whether the Soviets lost cosmonauts in outer space. The Prosecutors Podcast was the 2023 winner of the People's Choice Creator of the Year Award at CrimeCon. This October, they've already tackled the exorcism of Annalise Michel, the unbelievably bizarre Corpsewood murders in northern Georgia, an episode on creepy places, and the case of Zona Hester, also known as the Greenbrier Ghost, the only case that Brett knows of where ghosts appear to have solved their own murder. What brings a lot of Brett's many interests together is his love of mysteries. Today, for this October episode, we're going to talk about some fascinating mysteries and why we as people are so gripped by them. So this will be the first part of 2 episodes. Enjoy this one and join us next week for the next. So, hey, Brett, I just wanted to thank you once again for coming back for another October episode to talk about mysteries. You know, last year we got to talk a little bit about unexplained things. And then, you know, every week I get to listen to the Prosecutors Podcast, which I sort of feel like is a weekly mystery show. I love it when you talk about your October episodes and, you know, people think it's going to be so scary. I'm like, what are you talking about? Every month of the year is scary and true. But, you know, I just really appreciate the chance to talk to you guys, and just want to congratulate you and Alice on all the success you've had over the last few years, and on the really wonderful community that you've built.
Well, thank you, Jason. I mean, you're a very important part of that community, and I love coming on your show. You ask such great questions, and you know, there's nothing I would rather talk about than mysteries, horror, Halloween, October. I mean, this is my time of year, so I'm excited to be here.
I was going to ask you, were you into Halloween and mysteries as a kid? Because I was thinking as I was preparing for this episode, I was like, what mystery books did I read? And I was sitting and thinking about the different kinds of mystery books, and I realized, like, you know, everything was a mystery to me, whether it was like Murder, She Wrote on TV, which my mom really loved, or her Agatha Christie books. But even like history for me, like, how did Europe go to war, or how did the Holocaust happen? And some of the, you know, this is just tell you what a nerd I am. Some of the most defining moments of my life growing up, I was in the same place in front of my dad's record player and the row of green encyclopedias they had.
Mm-hmm.
I was constantly there. Heard my first Tracy Chapman album there. First girlfriend I asked out there. What else? I heard the Challenger on the radio explode, or the news for it. That's how I found out. Everything was in front of the encyclopedias for me because I always wanted to figure things out.
Yeah, it's funny that you said that. I knew as soon as you started saying that you're going to talk about encyclopedias, because that was a big thing for me too. Yeah, it's probably hard for a lot of people who are listening to believe, but there was a time when everybody had a set of, I don't know, 15-year-old encyclopedias, and that was your window to the world. And it was interesting because you're talking about this room, and we had a room kind of like that. You know, middle-class family, didn't have a lot of money, but we had one room that I'm seeing it in my mind's eye. On the left side was where the record player was. There was like a set of bookshelves. There was a record player on there, and there was a whole bunch of records. And then on the other side was the encyclopedias, where all the encyclopedias were. And there was a couch. Basically, there was no TV. That wasn't what the room was for.
Yep.
But I, so many times, sitting on that couch, listening to, we talked about this a little bit last time, I think, Thriller. Thriller was my big album. Listening to Thriller, reading the encyclopedias, that really was my sort of introduction to searching for truth and having questions and seeking answers and all that sort of thing. And I think you wonder, just with every generation, things are a little different. And is that something that's lost, or has something taken its place? I mean, maybe kids now are sitting in a room somewhere reading Wikipedia. I don't know. But there was something about, kind of like, Wikipedia has that whole thing where you read a Wikipedia article and you end up falling down some sort of rabbit hole. You're like going from one article to another. You end up, you start off with Mozart and you end up with like the Andromeda Galaxy. And how did you get here? I don't know.
You'll always end up with Nazis, though.
There you go. Well, yeah, and with the encyclopedias, World War II was always one of the entries that you would end up on. So I'm with you on all that.
Yeah, and I love that. It's great you make that point about Wikipedia and falling down the rabbit holes, because sometimes I don't think I appreciate that enough. But I remember so many times, and I think so many things I learn, I go and I grab the encyclopedia, kind of like Wikipedia in a way, and I would be looking for, pick a topic. I'm looking for something about World War II, and then all of a sudden I'm finding out about a famine in Africa, or because I've just flipped past the page and stopped. And I think that's one of the things that I love about learning in general, or even things like just exploring and solving any puzzles. You may go to set out to solve a certain puzzle or learn a certain thing, but along the way you'll trip across all these other things that may ultimately be more fascinating for you. And I remember you talking about I'm trying to remember which one it was. Oh, it was actually the mystery of what happened at Dyatlov Pass. And I remember you talking about how you originally tripped across it. Wasn't it just one of those like articles on, what was that? What was that?
It was crack.com, which I don't know if it still exists, but so it's interesting you talk about this sort of evolution, because early days, I remember the Scholastic book fair coming to school, and you get the little magazine that had all the books that they were going to have, and then you go and you could buy them. Yeah. And I was always looking for the mystery books, the sort of like, unsolved mysteries of the seas or something like that. I mean, I think the first time I learned about the Mary Celeste was in a book like that. And with crack.com, there was this period about, 15 years ago. I feel like maybe more like 20 years ago when I was a senior in college, and there were all these websites that popped up that would have these listicles that would be things like 5 greatest unsolved mysteries or 10 things no one can explain. And I just love that stuff. And I remember Dyatlov Pass was 5 mysteries that have a simple solution. That was the first time I've ever heard of Dyatlov Pass. And crack.com had it. Oh, it was paradoxical undressing, which it absolutely was not. But that's the thing about crack.com. It's not like we had the world's leading scientists doing this. It was just somebody put together 5 things and wrote on it. So but it's interesting with my sort of search for truth or whatever, the way it has developed, because now what I spend a lot of time doing is I'm watching YouTube videos that are basically the same thing. Same thing. The number of like 5 mysterious places no one can go and stuff like that. Videos I watch all the time.
It's very funny because if I left my YouTube on in the middle of the night, that's all it would be by the next morning. Those kinds of, depending on what I was paying attention to. One of the things I was thinking about when I first started listening to your podcast, and I'm probably going to get the year wrong. I think it was sometime, it was obviously after the pandemic, because you started after the pandemic, but you guys were in a little bit in terms of episodes. And one of the things that for me, as much as I enjoyed the true crime, I really enjoyed that sense of like having you and Alice sitting and having a conversation. And I sort of felt like I was your third guest, which was really nice. And it's really interesting to think about the impact that you can have on people that you don't know, or if I hadn't really dove into your community, you would have never known about. But one of the things that really stuck out to me on some of those episodes, like the Dyatlov Pass mystery, was listening to your level of excitement when you were doing those episodes. And I've seen it over and over again. Like you mentioned the Mary Celeste, which was that was the Canadian built ship that disappeared. Right. It started in Nova Scotia and then disappeared. Where was it that it disappeared?
I can't remember if it started in England going to Nova Scotia or the other way. But either way, they found it basically sailing perfectly fine, but with no crew.
With no
and
crew.
The mystery of what happened to them.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And I think it may have been like reverse of the Titanic. Titanic was built on the other side of the pond in Belfast and then came over here. I think it was built in Nova Scotia and then maybe went over there. But the point I'm making is that your level of excitement when you talked about those kinds of stories was just palpable for me. And I felt this like connection and this sense of like, this is a person who really is just naturally curious about the world and wants to flip over mysteries. But one of the things about being somebody who's interested in mysteries is I always wondered what happens when you do solve them or they are solved. It kind of takes something away.
No, I mean, I think it does. One of the problems is, it is funny. It is that is a really, it's the curse of doing a podcast where you get to talk about these things is I used to watch, if there was a YouTube video or an article or anything on things like Dyatlov Pass or the Eileen Moore Lighthouse Keepers, I would watch every video on that because I'd want to see it. And then I was really interested in it. Then you do the podcast on it. You do 4 or 5 episodes on something or even one episode and you really dive in, you read all the stuff and you get a pretty good idea of what happened. You do lose something. Like, it's been a while since I've seen an Eileen Moore Lighthouse mystery video. I don't find it as intriguing anymore. And the great thing about a lot of these mysteries is they'll never be solved. That bothers a lot of people. It's interesting, the true crime community, you've got people who only like to listen to solved cases. It's one of their things. They only like solved cases. They hate missing persons cases because they're obviously not solved. I don't understand that. Like I can barely get myself in that mindset because for me, I like the mysteries. I like the unsolved cases, whether it's the murders or the disappearances. But I really love those sort of classic mysteries. And the classic mysteries were a gateway for me to true crime. I didn't start off in true crime. I started off with the classic mysteries and then sort of that same allure of what happened, who did it, what is the answer, drew me into the true crime stuff. So as I think you and I have talked about before, I think the love of mystery is completely innate in humanity. It goes back as far as you can imagine. And we just see it in different forms today. It's not as if these novels aren't still popular, but you think of the 18th century with the great detectives, whether it's in the early, I really mean the 19th century, in the early 20th century with Agatha Christie or Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes and Poirot and even Edgar Allan Poe with the whole Murder in the Rue Morgue thing. I mean, that was sort of big, huge back then. And now we have true crime. And some people think that true crime is a new phenomenon. It's not. It's just the latest iteration of this desire, I think, to solve mysteries.
Yeah.
Decisions.
Wait a minute. Are you still looking for cars on Carvana?
Yeah. Decisions.
When I used Carvana, I found the exact car I was looking for in minutes. Bought it on the spot.
Electric or full diesel? Decisions.
Come on, you've been at it for weeks. Just buy it already.
You're right. Crossover it is. Decisions decided.
Whether you know exactly what you want or like to take your time, buy your car the convenient way with Carvana.
And a lot of, there have been a couple sort of true crime or historical cases that involved crime that I've, researched recently, either for my own, just out of my own curiosity or to do some kind of work with someone. And, one of the things that I realized, earlier this year, I did an episode on a woman named Patty Cannon, who in the 1800s and maybe through the 1830s, she was a illegal slave trader on the Delmarva Peninsula. Like the border of Maryland and Delaware on the peninsula was very ill-defined. So, she used that to sort of like escape authorities and all sorts of other stuff like that. But she was involved in illegal slave trading. She was involved in kidnapping free blacks from Philadelphia, like who were living in areas like that. And actually, the fascinating thing about the story is a plantation owner from Mississippi who got some free blacks through her gang and knew they weren't actually slaves, plus the mayor of Philadelphia are the ones who teamed up to finally stop her gang. But the really interesting thing about it, and going back and finding the history, more recently, some more solid historical books have been written, but all the beginning early stories on her were these fictional mystery accounts that were written for magazines. And, it's really interesting because her own story is wild enough on its own. I mean, like, you got this lady running a gang during that time, illegal slave trading. Like, she was packing people in houses and tying them up and throwing them on boats and sending them to the South. It's a pretty wild story on its own, but something about the fictional mystery of her and building up the unknowns went into these magazine articles. And they were hugely popular at the time. And I didn't even think about that. And as I was looking at others, many other real life stories were told through those fictional mystery lenses. And it makes me wonder, like, what is it about, like, the open-ended part of stories? Like, even in a solved case in true crime where you have an arrest, I think we still gravitate to the parts that are unknown. I was listening to your episode last night on Asia Degree, and I was thinking to myself, just looking at some of the questions in the chat, where people want all the answers, all the answers. And I think to myself, oh, we're probably never going to get all the answers. We're going to have to do some supposition, and that's going to be okay. And so I wonder what attracts me to that kind of stuff. But it's just interesting to me that I find that piece of things that are, I almost, I was once working with a guy who's running a large government agency, and he was like, people don't like ambiguity. A lot of people don't like ambiguity, but people like you and me, Jason, we love ambiguity because we can paint whatever we want in there. And I think there's some truth to that for me. Like, I like having missing pieces, if that makes sense.
Well, I think you've put your finger on a couple things that are pretty interesting. I mean, one is the tendency to embellish even the most extraordinary story. And you see that a lot. I mentioned the Eileen Moore Lighthouse Keepers. And that story is enigmatic no matter what. I mean, the idea.
Scotland one?
It's a Scotland one. Yeah. 3 lighthouse keepers all vanished without a trace. What happened to them? That in of itself is mysterious and creepy enough, but even that was embellished with this notion that they had written these logs about a storm, the storm raging when there was no storm, and people watching the lighthouse, it was clear blue sky, and they were talking about storms. Well, none of that ever actually happened, right? But it's people add to the legend, even no matter how attractive the legend is. And I think one of those things ties into sort of conspiracy theories, because it's interesting to me, it's always been interesting to me, how people really don't want. Number one, they may not want the answer at all, but if they get the answer, they don't want it to be simple, right? They don't want it to be straightforward. They hate that, as a matter of fact. Yeah. Stephen King, in On Writing, talks about how when you're writing a horror novel or you're writing horror fiction, the time that you've got the reader in your palm of your hands is when they're in a room and the door's closed and they hear a noise and the door's shaking and the reader is imagining all these horrible, terrible things behind that door. What is there? What is going to get them? And the worst thing you could do is open the door, because no matter what you show, no matter what's standing there, it won't be as bad as their imagination just sort of running free. They'll be like, oh, well, that's bad, but maybe not as bad as it could have been, right? Once they see it, it loses a lot of its magic. And I feel like people are like that in a lot of cases, the true crime cases. I mean, Delphi is a good example. I think Delphi was a case we all wanted solved for years. These two girls brutally murdered, just the worst case you can imagine, a nightmare for so many of us, whether you have kids or not, but particularly if you have kids, you could really feel the impact of that case. And people wanted it to be this monster. They wanted the person who was arrested to be this horrible, terrible, sophisticated serial killer monster. And they arrest a guy who's, works at a CVS, who's like a little overweight and short. And he just didn't fit the picture, right? And I think because he didn't fit the picture, because when you open the door, he wasn't what you expected, I think that's one of the reasons that people have gravitated so much to conspiracy theories in that case, because that is more satisfying to them. And I think you see that in a lot of places. And a lot of times the mystery, if it is resolved, one of the reasons I think it's disappointing is because usually it's not actually that interesting anymore.
A lot
it's
more
like,
simpler than...
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that, it's a really good point because, thinking about that Delphi case, I had noticed it in 2017 and read something really briefly about, two girls on a bridge, one of them recording a suspicious man approaching them and them ending up dead. And that in itself on its own was quite mysterious. And, and I wonder, it takes till 2022 for them to make an arrest. And I wonder whether part of it too is also our fears that it needs to be more complicated than that. Because if we can't solve it for that long, it needs to be way more complicated, or we lose interest, because part of the reason we're not necessarily really acknowledging that our interest is to some extent in the mystery. And you're right, this does go back to history, because I think of things like the death of Nero, right? That was crazy enough on its own. But then everyone made stories up afterwards about how he's secretly still alive and hiding. Tupac. I remember when Chelsea Clinton was like, he's not dead. I'm like, oh no. But I'm wondering whether there is something about our interest and our fears that need things to be a little bit more complex than they are in reality. I interviewed this year Bruce Maitland, whose daughter Brianna went missing in 2004. And I was thinking to myself, and I visited Vermont after that interview, and over the summer went to all the different sites. And I remember standing across the street from the where the barn was, where she went missing. And, just noticing small details that I couldn't notice not being there, how short the distance was from her work, how the roads curved. And it sort of narrowed the possibilities of what could have happened in my mind. And I remember this thought going through my head where I was like, when we figure out what happens here, it's going to be a lot simpler than we think. And I don't know, it kind of deflates the balloon a little bit.
Yeah. And I think the cases where people get the maddest at us is when we're like, yeah, it's not that complicated. those are the ones that make people angry. I think Maura Murray was one of the first, where we do Maura Murray, which is also up there. It's a great mystery, incredible mystery. And we were like, yeah, she probably just wandered down the road and then died of exposure, and her body's in the woods somewhere and they never found her. And people hate that. They hate that. They want it to be, some really complicated, she was driving up there with somebody else, or she was pregnant and running away from her boyfriend, or a serial killer picked her up. And they want it to be that. They don't want it to be something simple and straightforward. We talked about conspiracies before. We're a week after 9/11. I think 9/11 is a similar thing. It is strangely, for a lot of people, more comforting to think there is some massive organization out there with enough power and control over our lives that they could plan and pull off 9/11. That is more comforting than 20 random terrorists got into the country somehow and pulled this off, because that is so simple and so straightforward and could so easily be replicated. And we're just so powerless against that. Whereas the notion of someone's in control, it's almost like faith in God, right? The notion that someone's in control, even if they're a bad person, the fact that someone's in control is better than randomness and chaos. I think you see that a lot.
That's right. And so much of there's something to the randomness of the world, like whether it's good things or bad things that happen, because I certainly, like, I think about the blessings of my life. It's not all because I'm like hardworking, brilliant, and whatever. Some of it is just random luck, and some of the bad things are also just random, and that can be more frightening. It's interesting. So, I was in New York for 9/11 and covering it. And we were actually having a conversation, one of my colleagues and I in the office this week. We were talking about a woman that we had hired. I don't know, like, it may have been like, it was probably like 15 years after 9/11. And, a real turning point for me, she was our accountant. So it's like a trust job, right? Real turning for me was when we were sitting, and it was like September 10th of the year. We were talking about 9/11, and she starts telling me about the conspiracy. Her conspiracy theory about how the US government had actually blown up the buildings, and that like X, Y, or Z would not have fallen down. And I was like, I was there that night. I was like, I watched number 7 World Trade Center. I watched 2 fall. I watched From Across the Brooklyn Bridge. I watched 7 burn right in front of me. She's like, there's no way jet fuel would have done that. I was like, I was there. Like, you are not hearing me.
Yeah. It's just, I don't know. And with stuff like that, it's funny how those things become matters of faith, where arguments don't actually matter. Someone is convinced, whether it's that or the moon landing. I mean, you can explain 1,000 different ways how we know we landed on the moon. Not the least of which are all the rocks we brought back from the moon. But people who are convinced, I mean, do you really think if Vladimir Putin knew that we didn't land on the moon, which the Russians certainly would have? The excuse is always, well, the Russians, they were fine just letting us have it because they didn't want to admit their failure either, which doesn't make any sense. But even assume that was true. Right now, if Vladimir Putin knew we didn't land on the moon, he would totally sell us out. Like,
he probably would.
But you have all these people, and you have growing numbers of people who believe stuff like this. And I think there's sort of a deep psychology to this. And one thing we talk about on the podcast, I love conspiracies. Like you said, some of the things that we cover where I get the most excited are the mysteries. They are the conspiracies. The lost cosmonauts, or the moon being hollow and it's all a cover up, like all that stuff. I love that stuff. But it's kind of like, it's like, I mean, I don't want to say it's like drugs because that makes it sound worse. It's like drinking, right? Like a lot of people can drink alcohol and they're perfectly fine and everything's great. But some people, when they drink alcohol, it triggers something in them. They become alcoholics and they have to just cut it out altogether. And I feel like conspiracies are kind of like that. There are people who can dive into these mysteries, have fun with them, have fun with the conspiracies. But then there are people who, once they start down that path, they start seeing conspiracies everywhere.
Yeah. And I've seen it, like in the case that you were mentioning, Delphi, where I've seen people go through that transformation from, okay, I'm really interested and curious about this. Wouldn't it be interesting if this happened or that happened, to the I'm convinced that it's this conspiracy. And then all of a sudden rolling over into like conspiracies outside of that. And that's a really interesting metaphor about like the drinking piece, because for me, as somebody who's a recovering alcoholic, I totally relate to that, because I view the world, like, I don't look at drinking as inherently a bad thing. I look at it as something I can't handle. I can't handle. Other people, it works for them, or they find a way to manage it. Or it brings more joy than good and it doesn't bring harm, right? Whatever mix, but that's like not me. But I too love conspiracies, and I constantly find myself battling ludicrous ones that will cause harm. But like 2 of my favorite first books, they weren't my first books that I read by Stephen King, but 2 of my favorite first books were Firestarter and Stand. And Firestarter, in part because it was about a government conspiracy. And I think it's driven my interest in government conspiracies, and maybe even some of my pursuit of journalism, because it was just so interesting and fascinating. And that there was a little bit of truth to the idea, like through things like MK Ultra.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of truth to it. So it made it really fascinating. But for me, what it did was like the conspiracy that Stephen King wrote made me more interested in the real stories of what happened as opposed to turning other things into conspiracies. And I think for other people, it actually works the opposite way. So, that's funny because lately I've been talking a lot about conspiracy theories in just such a negative fashion, but I do think that there is something from an entertainment value that's just awesome about them.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because on the one hand, I think I will say this, I try very hard to avoid conspiracy theories in the true crime cases we cover. It's not as if this isn't true of the historical cases, but it feels less true. It's not as damaging to talk about a conspiracy. Like if you're talking about a conspiracy of what happened to the Mary Celeste, that it was really an insurance fraud scheme, right? I mean, that's one of the conspiracy theories about that. And that the crew actually just got off on another boat. They had let this happen. They collected the insurance money. They split it with the other ship. I mean, that's a conspiracy theory about it. And that doesn't feel like it's all that damaging. Whereas getting into a conspiracy theory about a case that is being tried right now, for instance, you can see in real time, the damage being done and people being harmed and the justice system being corrupted. And it's really shocking to watch it. And it's also shocking to see people fall into it and fall into it so hard. And the inability to move those people, even with facts or just an attempt to approach it from sort of like, hey, let's take a step back. I mean, is it really likely that this is what's happening here? I mean, maybe it is, maybe it is. We keep an open mind, but I feel like we need some real hard evidence here, not just a story that sounds good. We keep going back to Delphi because it's such an obvious example. The defense in that case, for those of you out there who don't know, you have these two girls who were murdered. A man has been arrested. Like I said, he's just a manager at a CVS store. Nothing really that interesting about him. The defense comes out with a theory that this was actually a cult sacrifice organized by local whodunists who were sacrificing the girls as part of some sort of ritual. And man, it was like the defense saw how disappointed people were that it was their suspect or their client was the suspect. And they just went directly for the opposite because so many people who were disappointed by that, who were like, oh man, this guy really?
Like my boring weird neighbor is the guy. That's so
exactly
strange.
Like this. Yeah. This is number one, terrifying that guy pulled this horrible thing off that we've been talking about and fretting about for so long, but also disappointing. But then you throw them that sort of red meat of Odinist cult sacrifice, and it all the sort of like the most visceral sort of reptilian part of your brain just starts firing off, right? And you're back in the Salem witch trials, or you're back in the satanic panic, and there's something about those stories and about those ideas that we love. I mean, dopamine is just pouring into your body when you hear it. I'm not exactly sure why that is. I think that'd be an interesting thing for like a psychologist to look into. Why do people love these stories so much and these conspiracies so much? But you just see people eat it up.
Stop by O'Reilly Auto Parts for the power, performance, and reliability of a new Super Start battery. Visit O'ReillyAuto.com.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Well, and I think you may have I wonder whether part of what it is that makes conspiracy theories in sort of like those other kinds of stories much more safe than the ones that are ongoing right now is time. Because I think it's something like the Mary Celeste, because I know that it was Benjamin Briggs and his wife, I think.
And his daughter.
Yeah, his wife and his daughter. It was like a 2-year-old or 3-year-old daughter. I just remember Sarah and Sophia, and I can't remember which one's which. But they were on there. But if we're engaging in conversations right now, because that was in the 1870s, about different conspiracies, it's unlikely to harm anyone. But if it were 1873 or 1874 or 1875, I'm just making up a year for the year after, I think it would have a very different feel and a very different effect. And I think that's part of the reason why, like, I do enjoy going back and looking at cases and stories of the past, even in true crime, because there is, I think, a freedom to kind of like speculate or even not speculate, even talk about things that are absurd and knock them down without potentially doing any harm in the same way. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. It absolutely does. And you can sort of have fun with it without guilt, if that makes sense.
Yes, right.
Because anybody who likes true crime and likes mysteries and likes all this stuff, if you really sit down and think about it, there is something unsavory about it. You know, I mean, I always tell people don't feel bad about liking true crime. And I don't think they should, because I think it's, like I said, I think it's deeply ingrained in us. But you are deriving joy from somebody's worst day. And a lot of times a family is still out there mourning. You know, you take the missing persons. We talk about Maura Murray, Julie Murray, who I think you've had on your show. You know, she's still looking for a sister.
Yeah.
And for her, this is a very real, constant, present thing. This isn't, as Young Lee said when talking about Hey Men Lee, this isn't just a podcast for them.
Yeah.
And that's something that you know you always have to remember. But when you're talking about the Mary Celeste, like you said, everybody who was alive then, their kids are dead now, right? So there is not that possibility to do the damage isn't there.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking as you brought up Julie Murray, those exact words from Young Lee, this isn't a podcast for me. And that he said that Young Lee was the, for anybody who doesn't know, was the brother of Hayman Lee, who in 1999 was murdered in Maryland, and her former boyfriend, Adnan Syed, was arrested for him. The prosecutors did a great 14-part series, and actually recently did a great like summary episode for those who don't like 14-part series. They do it in 30 minutes. I don't know how you did it. But his point, like in one of the hearings over vacating Said's conviction, was it isn't a podcast for him. And I just thought that was so powerful for me as somebody who does, you know, interview people about missing persons cases or other things, just to handle that stuff with a different kind of care, because it means something very different for them. I was going to ask you about something. So back in, I don't know, this was like, it had to be like September of, would it be 2023? My years are getting blurred. You guys did the disappearance of Brianna Maitland. Mm. I think it was like a 2-parter or 3-parter. I think it was a 2-parter. And I had never heard the story. I knew nothing about Brianna Maitland. 2004 was a bit of a black box for me because it was coming right out of the Time stuff. Mm. And so I until I really listened to your more Murray coverage, I had heard the name but didn't know anything about it. But I'd never really heard anything about Brianna's case. Frightened me. Absolutely frightened me. Few things frightened me, like the coverage of the case or the picture of the car backed into a barn, her car parked into the back of a barn. And then you did your October episodes after that, which are the ones where you guys focus on sort of like spooky month type stuff. I found the Brianna Maitland story much more frightening than anything you covered that Halloween. And I wonder what it is about, because you've mentioned sometimes some of your listeners, I don't know if they get freaked out or they sort of peel away during the Halloween episodes. I don't know what it is about the real life scary things that people talk about that is easier for those mysteries, easier for people to digest than I don't know, the exorcisms and what I would consider other fun stuff like that.
No, I'm with you 100%. Right in September, I think in September and maybe November, I can't remember exactly the timeline, but right around then, we did what I think are the 3 freakiest cases we've done. Brianna Maitland, which I'm with you, that there's something about that photograph and how that all went down that is just, it is so unsettling. It's unsettling in a really sort of deep way that I can't really explain. And I can't really put my finger on it, what it is about that case, but it is very unsettling to me. The other one is the Jameson family disappearance.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's the photograph of a little girl. And that whole case, incredibly unsettling. And then the Jack family disappearance. I mean, those 3 cases, we did them right in a row. And they stick with me. I mean, those are the ones that I like lay awake at night thinking about. And I'm with you. Those are the ones that freak me out. The Halloween stuff, I mean, number one, it's mostly just true crime. But even the ones that aren't, I'm with you. I don't understand it. I think it's and I've Alice is one of these people. Alice finds the Halloween stuff much more unsettling than a lot of the true crime cases we do. And I don't know if that's just because, unfortunately, crime, the tragedies surrounding it are just part of life, and we kind of have internalized that in a way, and we're kind of numb to it. And the other stuff is more unusual and esoteric, and we're not numb to it. And so it scares us in a way it doesn't. I'm not sure what it is, but you are absolutely right. It has always been strange to me that people who will listen to some of the darkest, most disturbing stuff, 11 months out of the year, we get to October and they're like, nope, I'm out.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I wonder whether some of it's like with crime, even though some of it's mysterious, we think we have our heads around it. So like we feel safer, but when you're talking about ghosts and exorcism, and it may just be the way that I'm wired. I had a guy, Chris Susi, on earlier this year, who's paranormal investigator. And it was just very fascinating to have a conversation with him about ghosts. And one of the points that he made in there, we're talking about how people were afraid of ghosts. And he said, the most common ghost story he ever hears is about a loved one coming to visit someone after they died. And he was like, ghosts, the most common ghost story is about love. And it resonated with me. But I think it's just the way that I kind of tick, that those kinds of things are not scary to me. They're much more fun, like break out the candy, break out the candy, or like in my mind, when I think about something like ghosts, assuming they're not real, or that some of them are not real and some could be real, some may not be real. But there's a reason why we've created a lot of the myths that we've created around us. And I think a lot of them exist to comfort us. I'll take the example of, is it Ruthie McCoy? Mm-hmm. The Chicago woman whose apartment was broken into by her neighbors who came through empty space they had between the walls. And by the way, after you did that episode, I went and knocked on the medicine boxes throughout to make sure there was no empty space. Luckily, one is against the wall outside and one is against an elevator, so we're good.
There you
go. But so they came through the walls, they came through the medicine cabinet. The Chicago Police Department did not have its finest moment. And she ended up getting killed, but it became the story that inspired the whole idea of Candyman, the supernatural guy where you look in the mirror and you say Candyman 3 times, it comes out and bad things happen. But like somehow, for some reason, we've made these myths, and somehow Candyman is more comforting than what actually happened. That my neighbors came down to rob me and killed me and came through my medicine cabinet sounds way more frightening. So in a weird way, the story of Candyman feels to me like a less frightening version of reality.
I'm with you 100%. I don't know that most people would agree with us on that, but I don't know if the reason people don't agree with us is because they're sort of in denial. Like they don't want to accept how frightening it is that just some random guys came through the medicine cabinet to steal the lady's TV and shot her and killed her. And then she lay there dying while the police bumbled around and didn't go into her apartment for days afterwards. I mean, that maybe it's just we'd rather let ourselves be scared by Candyman than let that frighten us. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's a defense mechanism, but it is one of the things. It's funny when you do a podcast like this, and we were talking about this a little bit before we got started. we get to know our listeners so well. It's not like, you write a book and you shoot it off into the ether. And if you're really successful, maybe you go on a book tour and you meet some people for a couple minutes when you're doing a signing or whatever. And that's the feedback you get. Maybe you read some reviews. But podcasting, the communities are such a big part of it. And unless, I don't know, maybe Crime Junkie there's a lot of connection between the creators and the community. I don't know. But other than the biggest ones, I think there is this connection. And getting to know people and seeing their perspectives has been so fascinating for me, because I've seen this phenomenon and I don't really understand it. And I love that aspect of doing this. I love seeing different people's ways of reacting to things and then trying to figure it out for myself, because it really is eye-opening. And like I said, I wish we had a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a sociologist on with us today to explain sort of this. I mean, this is the kind of college class I want to take. I want to take a college class on horror movies and psychology of them or something.
Yep. This is where we'll pause for the day and call it a wrap. We'll be back next week for the second part of our episode, where we'll look a little deeper into mysteries and explore some of the reasons why it might not just be about solving puzzles, but it might be the journey along the way. This concludes the first of our 2 episodes with Brett. If you can't wait till next week for the second episode, you can find more of my conversation with Brett on a bonus episode that's on Patreon right now, where we explore the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass incident, the Prosecutors Podcast coverage of it, and updates since then. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a great listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For ad-free and early episodes and deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, including bonuses like the Dyatlov Pass one I mentioned, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again next week.
Need a little help? O'Reilly Auto Parts can help. Need advice? We've got advice. No matter what you need, we have thousands of professional parts people doing their part to make sure you have it. Exceptional customer service. Just one part that makes O'Reilly stand apart. The professional parts people.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.